Chapter 3, Independence. Part 3, The Conflict Turns Violent. The tax on tea. What actually caused a full-scale rebellion finally to break forth in the colonies was yet another issue: tea. This rebellion erupted with the move of Parliament to give financial support to the failing East India Company. The English victory in India had not brought them the profits that they were expecting. Thus, with a number of political maneuvers which not only gave monopoly rights of the company to trade with the colonies, the colonials could actually get tea much more cheaply from the Dutch, but also impose new taxes on the company's tea. Protests that these taxes were unfair were met by a coldness on the part of the royal government, which had by the early 1770s come to believe that any backing down on this issue would simply encourage further the independent-mindedness of the king's American subjects. The Boston Tea Party and the king's reaction. A major political explosion occurred in late 1773 with the arrival of a huge cargo of tea sent to the colonies. In most cases, Americans simply refused to unload the tea, as in New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, but in Boston, the tea was dumped into the harbor in a great public show, directed by Samuel Adams, by patriots dressed as Indians, stirring the wrath of the royal government. To demonstrate clearly the sovereignty of the king and his parliament in his colonies, the king's government enacted a number of coercive or intolerable acts, as they were known in the colonies, which in essence shut down the port of Boston in 1774. The goal of the king was essentially to strangle the town's economy in order to bring the colonists back under submission. And to make doubly sure that the colonists got the point, the king sent a huge occupying force of British troops to Boston and forced the townsmen to house these normally rowdy troops in their private homes, again to break the independent spirit of his colonial subjects. However, George's efforts at coercion merely united the colonies more closely in a mood of continental solidarity. In fact, the other colonies sent considerable financial and material aid to a crippled Boston. Thus, in 1774, a Continental Congress of representatives of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia to coordinate the colonies' efforts to get some relief from the King George. But their efforts to change the heart of the king failed entirely. By early 1775, the spirit of rebellion was gathering momentum among the growing number of Whigs or Patriots. Now, it would take only a small spark to set off a full-scale explosion of colonial fury. Violence in the Boston area, 1775. The battles of Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775. As tensions mounted in the early spring of 1775, the British military in Boston decided that it would be best to disarm their colonial subjects by seizing and destroying the stores of weapons and powder of the local militias. Thus, in April, a march of British troops was initiated by night from Boston to nearby Concord to seize military stores supplied there. However, these supplies had been mostly evacuated by the Americans, who were tipped off about British plans. By dawn on the 19th, the troops had reached the town of Lexington, where American militia had quickly assembled to face the large British force. Footnote: the militias are frequently referred to as the Minutemen because they were trained to assemble and move quickly, fully armed, normally to counter a surprise Indian attack. End of footnote. A shot rang out, no one knows by whom. The British charged the Americans, who were actually in the process of dispersing, and 8 were killed, shot or bayoneted, and 10 wounded. Thus the first shots of the War of Independence were fired. The British troops then moved on to Concord, where they were confronted by a rapidly increasing gathering of American militia. Another fight broke out between the two sides at the North Bridge, except it was this time the British who took the blows. British troops did what they could to locate hidden supplies, destroyed what they found, which was not a significant amount, and then regrouped to head back to Boston, tired and shocked at the day's business. But the worst was yet to come. Militia had gathered along the route back to Boston and began to fire on the exhausted, retreating British troops. British reinforcements subsequently arrived from Boston, and then both sides began to take large casualties. But eventually the British made it back to Boston. The shooting had now started in full. It would continue for another 7 bloody years. The Battle of Bunker and Breed's Hill, June 17th, 1775. In response to this event, some 15,000 colonial militiamen soon gathered in the heights surrounding Boston. They were supplied by muskets and cannon seized in May from Fort Ticonderoga by American troops under Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. With cannon in the hands of angry colonials dug into the heights surrounding Boston, the British in Boston now find themselves in a dangerous position. Thus, in June, an assault on one section of the American positions on Breed's Hill and nearby Bunker Hill was ordered to convince the colonial riffraff not to mess with the British redcoats. However, it took 3 British assaults on the American position on Breed's Hill to dislodge them, and the American withdrawal took place only after the colonials had run out of ammunition and only after they had inflicted huge casualties on their enemies. Over 200 British killed and over 800 wounded, an unusually high percentage of these being British officers. The Americans lost less than half that number, and their retreat was orderly. The British claimed this as their victory, but it was for them a costly victory, one they could not afford to repeat. Furthermore, the Americans demonstrated once again that they would not be easily defeated. Subsequently, the British attempted no such raid on any of the other American positions surrounding Boston. The convening of the Second Continental Congress in 1775. Following the events at Lexington and Concord, a Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia in May of 1775 to prepare for what was clearly shaping up as a full-scale war between America and England. One of the Second Continental Congress's first acts in June was to create officially a Continental Army and place George Washington in command of it. He was, in fact, in New York, headed to Boston to take command when the Battle of Bunker Hill took place. He arrived in Boston soon thereafter. Also, at Arnold's urging, the Congress authorized an assault on Canada to try to draw its colonial neighbors to the north into the war on the side of the American rebels. Thus it was that the Americans found themselves deeply involved in a major war with a major European power. It was going to take a miracle to succeed. But these Americans believed in miracles. They counted on them. They knew what a deadly mission they had attached themselves to. It was virtually unthinkable for a common people to come up against their king. The king was armed with a mighty, well-experienced army, manned by battle-tested professionals. These colonial patriots would be offering as their own army only local farmers and tradesmen, not professional soldiers used to the discipline of extended military duty. History had no examples they could think of where a common people ever succeeded in throwing off the power of a major monarch. On the other hand, they had plenty of examples of popular rebellions, all of which ended with the rebels hanging by their necks on the gallows. From this moment forward, these colonials would be considered under English law as traitors. And if this venture were to fail, they would all be hunted down and every one of them end up on the traitor's gallows. But they believed that they had a cause that demanded their lives in full commitment. Their America had been an experiment in government by the people themselves, an experiment ordained by God himself a century and a half earlier. They had answered that call, and God had proven himself faithful in this venture. Thus, this was the sole ground on which they stood, with the understanding that this was, after all, God's war, in which they were all merely foot soldiers themselves. God would see them through, for in God they trusted their destinies fully.